recording. I can record, yeah. Did you get this recording in process warning?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, okay. Yeah, just interrupt me for whatever reasons, by content or technical ones or whatever. Because I probably won't be able to read the chat. Um, okay, okay. Okay, this doesn't work. Ah, okay. So I start with a wide angle view before I zoom in. So it's a bit of like content that was not part of the article itself, or I actually wrote it for the article and then I cut out like the first 10 pages or so. Um, so I start with that to give a bit of context. We had the idea that different social logics have a material support and material support as a relative concept. So the material support contains like many diverse phenomena. And then we defined nature as the synthesis of these substrata of basis of a social world. Now, there's something weird about this. Even if we look only at one logic of a world, the phenomena can be quite diverse and also on very different ontological levels. It can be from a thunderstorm over a couple's fight, or some plants or whatever. Like these are like really diverse phenomena. Um, so the question is, what kind of principle is behind that synthesis? And if I got Gabriel right, then these three principles can be called partner, resource, and raw material. Um, so if something can be interpreted by mode B as a resource, it becomes part of its material base. Mm, mm, um, so here's a quote from the ecology presentation. When Gabriel says the notion of raw material resonates well with physical reality, it is a specific physical reality. It's not the reality of Aristotelian physics, for example, but a physical reality that is already rendered, so to say, by modern physics. Um, so there's something like a rendering mechanism in between. This is not a claim about what comes first, like science or capitalism. Um, it's what I'm interested in is not a causal explanation. Um, in any way, the way physics looks at the world cannot be reduced to mode C, even if it in fact is conducive to it and also historically influenced by it. We have a similar example with mode B. Um, here it is. Yeah, genau. Here's the talk about pronounced physical or physiological facts. But we need some mechanism that does the pronunciation. Um, that also counts for the classification of species, obviously. Um, it needs a specific work of classifying that enables mode B to latch on distinct features of reality. And this work itself is not necessarily social in itself, as much as it might be influenced by social logics. Like, for example, Linné's classificatory system goes beyond the workings of mode B. It cannot be reduced to social logics. So there are mechanisms that select, compose, structure certain features of reality and make them conducive to a social logic. And I think Slip provided us with these three mechanisms. He calls them undergirding technologies that provide such a synthesis. And um, for SLIP, these are speech, writing, and coins. I don't agree with coins here because coins seems to be already a social kind of mechanism. So I would probably propose something like computation or mathematics or whatever, but that's just a side note. Mm, mm, mm. Um, so I try to generalize this a bit. Um, we don't really care about the material or historical specificities of speech and writing, for example, but that they mediate the material in a certain way. So we can say they belong to different types of mediation. I call them, for my personal reasons, perceptual, symbolic, and literal, but these are just names. Um, but the claim is that these names belong to different properties, structures, form of subjectivation, and so on. Mm. So generally, those structures must be conducive or at least compatible with the topologies and the logics of our social worlds. But most likely they're going to be weaker. That is, they encompass a higher variety of compositions and possible structures and stuff. So I tried to flesh this out a bit to give, but I'm not gonna like go deeply into it, that we can associate different, for example, imminent inquiries of these media. So for example, we should um, when we want to know something about perceptual mediation, we should probably ask phenomenologists. Whereas when we want to know something about symbolic mediation, we should go to we should ask hermeneutics or psychoanalysis, um, because these are practices that kind of like specialize on a reflexive use of these media. Um, yeah, but as I said, I'm not gonna like go into it by detail. Yeah, maybe one detail is like that speech and writing kind of like hover between perceptual and symbolic mediation somehow. So language is like caught between speech and writing. There's some intermediary position of language there. It seems to have like a two-level. It seems always to be like a two-level thing, language. Mm, mm, mm. I'm gonna skip that. So in the presentation now, I want to focus on this middle part, state and what I call symbolic mediation. Mm. So here we have so the main category of B-dominated systems is property, and the material base of a property we call a resource. Gabriel identified two criteria for something must fulfill to become a resource. First, it can be extracted from its environment, and B, it can be discriminated by stable properties. I take this to mean stable over various contexts. Um, this second aspect is especially important for me. The state may extract something from its environment, but it already takes it as something. Like capital doesn't accept something as a given that has certain evident properties. The state, on the other hand, accepts such a given. Whatever enters the state already has some meaning to it. So the state kind of like just needs to get rid of all the context-dependent information, so to say. So intuition 2 is there's a rendering process that happens before something becomes classified by such properties. Before we start classifying something, we are already acquainted with it, so to say. And um, the referent is, so to say, already given, and it is given in a different world, and this world is the world of perception. It is not the world of linguistic mediation. It's a different world in which the referent must be given. Mm. Intuition 3. So I'm like collecting some somewhat overlapping and connected intuitions at the beginning. Intuition 3 is the state relates to communities, like language relates to perception and writing relates to speech. And this analogy has something to do with scale. Like the green categories below can render and organize objects only to a certain quantity. So there's a threshold on how many people you can organize via mode A. There's a threshold of how many objects you can oversee via perception. And there's a threshold for spreading information through speech. It seems like they all give too much information to upscale efficiently. So I have these three ideas from former discussions, and I kind of like in the beginning of my section, I try to pack these into an argument. And I do this with Son Rethel. Here's a quote of Son Rethel. Son Rethel argues that before there's like he has like two steps for abstraction. The second step is commodity societies, but there's the step before that he calls appropriation societies. And this kind of equals what Karatani and we call mode B societies. Um, so in appropriation societies, you separate production from consumption, or production from use. And you do that spatially, temporally, socially, and so on. Um, so Rechtel calls that production occurs without consumption, and in the exploiting part, consumption occurs without production. This alienation of products engenders a different object relation. That's where like abstraction comes into play. A different object relation that is more abstract because it is decontextualized. Like Son Rethel talks about the act of appropriation abstracts the product from the producer, reifies the human product. It's like a mere given, or like it's kind of a pun, like a mere givenness or takenness, he says. Son Rethel, though, argues that until commodity societies develop and coinage and all that stuff comes, there's no medium for functional societalization, no medium that would embody that abstraction like as money does. So for him, appropriation is only like an underdeveloped stage, so to say. Because he thinks that like you still exchange the the cows and whatever you exchange, so it's still concrete in his view. So Son Rethel would say no money, no abstraction, and with Slip and Karatani we can say that this is not fully correct. Mode B societies organize on higher scales. That means they have to logistically cross large spatial and temporal distances. And they do have they do have a way of functional societalization, or what Son Rethel calls functional societalization, similar to the way money works in commodity societies. And this is the bureaucracy and accounting and all of that. And they also have a medium that kind of embodies that sort of abstraction. And this is obviously not money, but it is writing, um, or a specific use of writing, you should probably say. Um, and this specific use engenders also an abstraction that is an abstraction of, like, on its own. It's a different type of abstraction, namely a classificatory type of abstraction that has a different structure. Uh, yeah, that has a different structure than um, abstraction in mode C. So, oh, hmm. So in what Sonrethel calls natural communities, so this is like before appropriation societies, the object relation can be rendered via perception as a sort of acquaintance. We are acquainted with those objects. Phenomenologists notoriously say that things directly appear to somebody as something and for a certain purpose. It is not a tree, but always this tree in front of me, a tree that to make ships of or to perform a ritual with or whatever. So we don't need to ascribe functions to the things. They already, like, this is like the always already talk of phenomenologists. They always already appear as affording certain actions. I think we can kind of like image that as a sort of overlap. There's the thing on the one hand, and there's me on the other hand, and there's an overlap between us, like this we can call this appearance. Um, and what the phenomenologist does is to say this overlap is foundational. The thing and me are just like as something by themselves, are just abstractions from this original overlap. But what is real is like always overlapping. Um, in societies of appropriation, this is no intuitive idea, um, since like this foundational overlap is no intuitive idea. Um, since product or resource and consumer or user come from different worlds. So like they start from different angles and they have to be connected like by some artificial process. Um, so we first need to establish that relation that we always already have in Mode A societies or Mode A in the local community. Uh, so I kind of think that like a table like this is kind of like an emblematic metaphor for understanding that, for this matching process. So we have like different functions on the one side and different domains on the other side, and we kind of like need to make them match. But this is some work we need to do. Whereas like the phenomenologist, whereas like the mode B perceptual model would like directly start from this intersection here. Mm. Yeah, I think this is to think of such a table as a guiding metaphor is more helpful than what, for example, Scott does in Seeing Like a State. Scott has this talk of synopsis, and this is like, I mean, this is fully correct. Like writing and writing has to, and also those tables and maps and all the tools of the state have this purpose of like generating an overview. But a visual metaphor also hides something, and that is that main structure of classification is propositional. It's not like a visual overview, it's not an image. And the main difference between those two, I don't know, figures, um, is that propositions allow inferences. So propositions provide you with a structure that has like a high inferential force. And when we look at that, like when we take this as the main purpose of the state to allow to generate a high inferential force. I mean, first of all, I think this is quite plausible, right? Like you want the bureaucrat to be able to generate new knowledge from the table without like having to go to all the places. Um, and for that, you like need to be able to make inferences. And this makes it highly plausible, like that you go for a propositional structure. Um, and to take this now as the main goal, or like as something for what like the state aims for, is I think especially useful because there are not so many structures that support many reliable, stable inferences. So that gives us a kind of like a good argument why the state favors so much a classical world. There's a logistical reasons for that. Um, mm, yeah, like the logistical reason is like to allow a bureaucrat to make conclusions in absence of the referent in the perceptual world, without having the acquaintance. So we got writing as a material medium that allows easy transport and condensation of information, but it is not just any writing, it is writing for the purpose of accounting, and drawing inferences from that. The relevant structure is a propositional one, we said that already. And though writing is not necessary for that, obviously, I can draw inferences also by talking, obviously, formal inferences by also just by talking. It is conducive to it. Um, I think that's clear because but yeah, because like writing it allows and it kind of like also favors situations where you can sever the referent uh, from the from the meaning of a word. So you don't need to be acquainted with the referent. Um, so I mean, there were also some notes, but I'm not gonna close. Some ideas on how that connected to Badiou and the idea of the power set as kind of like a possible model for the state. Um, but I'm not gonna go into that here now. And there are also some intuitions or some more intuitions on what the structure of perceptual mediation is. Um, so on the one hand, there are like phenomenological insights, um, like that are kind of stable throughout different authors. Like the world, the perceptual world is context dependent. Things appear to be purposive, um, or ready to hand. Um, it's always kind of like vague, ambiguous, ever shifting. And also there's this notorious self-reflexivity in there, be it the reflexivity of self-consciousness or of being with a capitalized B. And there are also attempts of formal reformulations. I like made some collections of examples there. Um, I think it's interesting that there like one can make out roughly three tendencies of what formal features are interesting in these different attempts. So often we have like arguments for pre-reflective self-consciousness, or argument for like the existence of being different than beings. Um, and these arguments often take the shape of a regress argument. And this is interesting for people who try to like work formally because this gives them like a nice point to latch on. They seem to go for two options to resolve regress. Either you give up consistency, this is something what Priest does, for example, with Heidegger, or you give up well-foundedness. This is, for example, what Kenneth Williford um, goes for. And there's also like a third camp, which kind of like goes for paracompleteness. This might be like Husserl and also the Deleuzian camp. Corey Shore. Corey Shores writes something about Deleuze in that direction. I'm just alluding to that, and this is certainly all beyond my grasp. But I try to capture some phenomenological ideas about perception and kind of like make them ready for a formal rearticulation. So I kind of like have some formal features in mind, but I'm like not explicating that because I cannot do that. Um, but it's kind of like there as a background. Um, so the main question for me now is how do we move from something like that on the right-hand side to something like that on from the left to the right-hand side? Um, what cognitive operations are necessary, like to move from one to the other? Um, in my section, I kind of like from this pressure of drawing inferences, and from adapting, from making this transition from the left to the right, I kind of like isolated three aspects. I'm gonna only talk about the first one and the third one. Um, so the first one is isolation of resources. So this is the point Gabriel already has made quite clear in the ecology presentation. Property is about alienation, extraction, and closure. A resource thus must be something that is alienable. So let's look at a world. I took a local grove, a local forest, to see how it is given in perception. The first thing that we can say is that this world, this grove, is perspectival or perspectival. Um, so when we talk of the grove as it appears in perception, we don't mean something like this here. Um, this is in some sense an impossible perception, not because it's from above, but because the observer would need to be like equally dispersed over the space to have a view from that. There's no perspectivity in there. So when we talk about, or when I talk about a grove, I mean something like that here. And for a phenomenologist, that would be like the only groves that exist actually. Um, so to produce a panorama like that, the principle of synthesis of these different images, like we have different images that go into different perspectives, the principle of synthesis must be localized. It must be a part of the world that it perceives. Which means that there must be in principle that there generally must be another view from which you could see like this the entity of that viewpoint. Um, so there's something almost animistic about phenomenology here, which is not always made explicit. Like the reduction that phenomenology engenders exposes a structure where there can be no blind or deaf world as a matter of principle. There's no world that does not see itself. There must be always this inhabitant that um, um, and this inhabitant is like a structure of the world. It's not dependent on some special entity or so. Mm. Second thing, the perceived world is not just a set of things. It is more a whole that appears to itself. Um, a world is not just something that you recognize from the outside. Inhabitants of this world are not blind, we could also say, to the world in which they live. So this is quite opposite to, this is a quote by Burhanuddin Baki. Um, uh, this is quite the opposite of how Badiou seems to conceive of a world. So the quote here is, "The world is not generally presented within its own immanent closure, unless, of course, it belongs to itself, an impossible state, um, since self-belonging is banned. Within any world, the world itself is absent. Consequently, an inhabitant of A does not know A." Um, and I think for perception, this we can like claim the opposite. Um, every world belongs to itself. So once we have this some set of elements, we also have this. We have like the world of these elements. And once we have the world of these elements, we also have this self-reflexive structure. Mm. So we do not only perceive things in the world, we also perceive the world of those things. And the other insight is that the entity that provides the principle of unity of this world is part of this world. And this is what generates, right? Like, hard to go back here. This is what generates this, or at least it is one aspect of the perspectival structure that is important to perception. So now, for the state to alienate stuff and find cross-contextually stable properties, it has to perform a reduction on this complex, non-well-founded, messy thing. So let's take a property like green. We cannot see this property. We can only see this green of this leaf in this specific conditions, in these specific conditions. So when we perceive this green leaf, we co-perceive the world of the grove, the complex interactions of lights and shades and the wind and whatever. And we also co-perceive ourselves as the principle of synthesis of this grove. I tried to express this by saying this green is a set that already includes, refers to a set that already includes the world of the grove. So we have something like, I hope, something like that. When we take this red circle as what the name this green refers to. I kind of like tried to capture that. I don't claim that to be like in any way proper, but I kind of like I think it captures some idea. Um, the growth is kind of like included when I perceive this thingy. Now let's take a general property like being green. I mean, we cannot perceive that, but um, like let's take this monochromatic green as a kind of like stand-in. Um, so also this leaf has like this leaf in front of me has the property of being green, but this property is different because um, it is green disregarding of the world around it or me perceiving it. At least that's the idea. So there are like some properties that are um, independent of the world. And we could kind of like express that somehow like that. So when we have like this set of elements and all the properties and relations and names, whatever, like as a structure on top of that, the reduction of the state works kind of like by selecting some of them and like sorting out others. So it takes all the elements of the world except of the world itself, and it takes all the subsets except of those that include this world. So, and there are probably also other reductions, but this is like the main thing. So all these red ones would disappear. And with that, we kind of like get something like that, where the surrounding world and the self-reflexive structure disappear. Um, so why is this interesting to me? Because at first it seems like a very simple reduction that is done, but it actually really changes the structure. This extraction of some properties and some elements really changes the structure of what a world is and how a world is structured. Um, so I hope this kind of like replies to Dennis's question, where you asked like, oh, also living beings in the world like perform a reduction. Yes, they do. Also the fungi does. In fact, all perceptual worlds are already reductions on a given set of data, if you like. But to the fungi, for example, there's a difference whether like it also reduces like the forest to probably dead plants, but there's a difference to between a dead plant close to me and a dead plant far away. So I tried to express this difference, and probably one could do that in better ways, but that's the way I tried to like capture that the indexical case kind of like includes the world of this plant. So to kind of like flesh this change of structure out a bit like phenomenologically, um, we can now think of a forest that does not see itself. So there's kind of like a blindness from inside the forest suddenly. The unity of the set of trees is only recognizable from the outside by the predicate that separates this set of trees from the total number of trees. Um, so this was the first point concerning extraction. It has like a big effect on the the structure of worlds, on the appearance of worlds. The second point I focused on is precisification of vagueness. Um, so there's quite an intuitive idea that perception is always something vague, and also like in phenomenological descriptions, like vagueness always like turns up. But they're also like and they're like mm, concepts in phenomenology that I would say are structure or like are I use the word structure way too often, but I cannot help myself. That are in principle um, vague. And one of these concepts is horizon. Horizon is something that belongs to every world. So we can, yeah, wait, I first explained that by. So there are like different levels of horizon. The first one would be um, I have something on which I'm focused, like ignore the red stuff that should appear later on. I have like an object on which I focus, and everything of every such object appears against a background, a scene that contains also invisible parts. So when I attend to them by virtually moving inside the scene. There's a scenery to that in which I could possibly move. Um, and there's also kind of like a second meaning to horizon, that is that each scene also has some blurry periphery that kind of belongs to it like a halo. So I attend to this periphery by virtually moving outside of the scene or by broadening my attention. So this is what this quote by Husserl refers to. I can let my attention wander away from the writing table, which was just now seen and noticed, out through the unseen parts of the room which are behind my back, to the veranda, into the garden, and so on and so on. Now this causes kind of like a theoretical problem. There are for every element that we add to the horizon of the clearing, when we kind of like expand our attention, it is clear that there are other elements that we can add with the same right. And it is equally clear that we cannot add infinitely more objects to the scene. So there's some random city that doesn't belong to the forest or this clearing or this tree that we attend to. Um, Now, but in between those two situations that we can clearly locate, um, there's like this big area, this gray area in between, that kind of like is specific to the horizon, um, where we don't know like if it actually belongs to the situation or not. Um, in the everyday world, I would say these problems do not really matter because such borderline cases we don't even care. Like these problems don't cause practical problems. Um, Now for the state, they do cause problems. Um, for example, here we have a quote from Scott from the book Seeing Like a State, and he kind of goes into the history of forestry in Germany in the 18th or Prussia in the 18th century, how they after some crisis of how do you say that over harvesting of forests, kind of like try to rationalize the system. And here's how it worked. Walking abreast, several resistants carried compartmentalized boxes with color-coded nails corresponding to 5 categories of tree sizes, which they had been trained to identify. Each tree was tagged with the appropriate nail until the same plot had been covered. Because each assistant had begun with a certain number of nails, it was a simple matter to subtract the remaining nails from the initial total and arrive at an inventory of trees by class for the entire plot. The same plot had been carefully chosen for its representativeness, allowing the foresters to then calculate the timber and giving certain price assumptions the revenue yield of the whole forest. So we can really see how this matching process and this how it starts to become possible to um, estimate things over, like in visual absence from the forest, and also over longer time scales and bigger scales of forests. Um, Now, the interesting thing is now for the boss for the accountant who counts the nails, the problem of vagueness is already solved. So for his eyes, the problem of vagueness doesn't show up. Um, but for his assistants, the grove appears quite differently because for them, it's all like the whole view on the forest is mediated by the problem of sorting the continuous variety of plants into distinct classes. So, for example, some trees branch out far down. You don't know what is a trunk and what is a crown. Others appear gnarled or diseased, and so on. Or even like a small tree might appear even smaller next to a bigger tree and stuff like that. Um, so we can kind of like imagine how different subjectivities arise from this problem. Um, like one might be kind of like driven into obsessive compulsion and like look for ever finer criteria to like solve that problem of vagueness, finding more and more categories and more criteria. Another assistant might be like after a while like really annoyed by this pointless work and kind of like decides to turn a blind eye on it and kind of like randomly categorize them. Um, And a third one even might be like deliberately overlook some trees because they have some significance for that, for them. This is what Scott calls infrapolitics. So because it goes like there might be political decisions that go below the radar or that fly below the radar of the accountant. Um, but I will focus on the first one. Um, on the first two strategies. So the obsessive, um, we can kind of like associate those two strategies with two kinds of forms of state. So the first obsessive one um, kind of looks like the classical Prussian state, like the emblematic example of the modern state of the 18th century and so on. Um, and I give a short sketch of those two strategies, and then I'm already kind of like done. Um, the first strategy looks like we have a set of plants here, and it has two predicates. One is timber, and one is weed. And weed is everything that's not timber. Now, first we sort out everything that is definitely not, it's definitely weed, and then we sort out everything that is definitely timber. And we want to do different things with timber and wheat. The weeds are to be cleared so that they don't take sun or nutrition from the trees, and the timber trees, for example, need to be freed of branches or stuff like that. So there's some practical relevance to those two categories. Now, when you have like, if you're lucky, then like everything works out, but most likely there will be like some leftover trees. What to do with them? I might make up a new category for them, like firewood, but then the problem might just appear on the next level, right? Like there might be some trees where it's not clear whether they are firewood or timber. So I cannot escape this problem, but it kind of like keeps me getting finer and finer in my distinction. And this is, I would say, mostly how we view the relationship of mode B to the material base, like as this obsessive Prussian state kind of image. But Scott also kind of elaborates on a distinct strategy that he exemplifies with the absolutist state of France in the 17th century and 16th century, I guess, also. And this second strategy could be like to give like a general model of that, could be described like that. We also have like those two predicates that are mutually exclusive, that stays the same. But now we first like sort out everything that is by and large timber. So under some precisification, it counts as timber. And then we go we sort out all the things that are by and large wheat. And if we're lucky, everything works out, and most likely we'll have some intersection. The interesting thing here now is that the absolutist state kind of like does not try to avoid this ambiguity, but it kind of like uses that ambiguity to exploit it on a situative level. So, for example, when it's about taxing, we might say, oh, it's timber. And we can say that because it is both. Um, but if we want to avoid the local communities for like to enter the forests for cutting firewood or stuff like that, we might say it is weed. Um, and so we can clear it out of the forests, or we can get rid of it. Um, so I find this interesting because like this problem of vagueness appears, or like different forms of the state have different solutions to the problem of vagueness. They deal with it in a different way. So we have like this gappy solution in the beginning and this glotty solution of the absolutist state. But all work or refer to this problem of vagueness. Finally, there was a question by Dennis. I also wonder about communal forms of land ownership in which boundaries are also a problem. How do cattle farmers share some grazing lands together, such that the land is not overgrazed, for example? Here we have a non-statist mode in which there's still the problem of vagueness. So I think problems with vagueness are not necessarily specific to mode B. It is, the question is on how they solve it. Or one could say, or maybe one could say they have different problems. Like the problem for the state is how to, at least for them, yeah, I'm not fully sure about that, but I think the main problem for the state would be how to avoid ambiguous or vague states, whereas under mode A, or like in this situation of like shared land ownership, this is not a problem. Like you cannot avoid this. The problems arise from accepting or like accepting from the fact that there is this ambiguous zone of in-betweenness. And then you have to find like solutions after you have accepted that. The problems for the state kind of like come from not accepting that ambiguity. I'm not sure like if that really counts for like this second Frenchy model. Um, yeah, I'm not fully sure about that, but um, And from this one can say that like the solutions, at least like in comparison to this Prussian model, the solutions look different. I'm not sure how they solve such problems, but I'm pretty sure like at least until a certain scale, problems will be like solved on a situative level, like you talk to each other. Um, so yeah, like that was a reaction to that question. Um, Here's a short summary, but like, yeah, nah, I'm gonna cut it there. Um, yeah. Otherwise I would have to read that out and it doesn't work anyway. So, uh, I make a stop here.
Yeah, it was an amazing presentation. On that last point, I think it makes sense. I think that the state wants to kind of be blind to the overlap or the ambiguity. Like you said, it wants to avoid it until that overlap leads to something like a conflict or dispute. Then it becomes like something to be resolved in court, for example. Then the state must be aware of that vagueness and it must adjudicate it, you know, and come up with a law maybe. But, you know, there is another way of solving it, which is not to take it to court, but to, like you said, talk it through, come up with some kind of provisional agreement, which doesn't necessarily mean it's legally binding, but some kind of just an agreement with your neighbor. Um, but I think it's interesting because, yeah, the work of Lynn Ostrom, it starts from exactly this point where she tries to analyze communities that share resources outside of the state. And she shows that there are many communities throughout history that successfully, you know, preserve like land or fish or whatever natural resource they need. They can preserve it without referring to the state or to laws. Um, so yeah, I think this is an interesting problem that want to think more about. But thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it starts to get interesting when you have to organize it on higher scales. I'm sure you have like, I mean, right? Because the state solutions become only relevant up like at a certain level of scale. So I wonder, I mean, I haven't read Ostrom and so on. I wonder if they're like if they provide examples on the like on the scales of states or something like that. Because
Yeah.
like on a small scale, it's kind of like clear that it works. Um,
Yeah, exactly. I think the scale question is the biggest one. Yeah, she provides a lot of examples, and some of them get pretty big. I think on the scale of maybe cities, but
mhm.
yeah, I don't know. There does seem to be like problems when you get to the level of a state, and that's I think almost kind of how Karatani's transition between mode A and mode B kind of happens too. It's like it feels like it's a scaling issue once you have the plunder redistribution. Like the plunder redistribution of mode B seems to be more efficient at larger scales. But I don't think I don't think Cartani necessarily says that's a rule. It's just that's how it happened in history.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really, really interesting. Like, where is actually the core, like the cause of the scale dependency that seems to be somehow there? Um, because like from this like very general structural view that the subset has, like from this topological view, there's no specific reasons why, for example, mode A shouldn't work on higher scales. So I mean, I was even wondering if scale dependency has probably even more to do with like these specific media. That, for example, that it's not actually about mode A, but that it's about like these media which are like specifically conducive for mode A or mode B. So perception, I think it's quite clear that perception has a natural scale dependency. Um, you like you can only like um, connect via perception a certain number of people. Like um, you even have like these, like grooming stories of Robin Dunbar, like, and those numbers of people with whom you can like keep contact through grooming, and that speech kind of like extends this number, but there's like a clear physical scale to this media. Um, I mean, I'm not sure about that, but it was something that came up, that probably like the scale dependency comes more from these media than from the actual social modes. Oh, there are like many messages. I don't know, like, do the people who wrote something in the chat just want to explicate that verbally again?
Yeah, I think like I think that I have I'm oh just before starting, I think it was also a brilliant presentation. I think there are a lot of issues that you bring that are very exciting, but just to remain on the topic at hand, I think that there's an issue that really I don't know. I get a lot confused because I have a hard time understanding this transition. First, due to the fact that it seems easier to account for mode C under mode A dominated social worlds than finding out exactly where mode B is,
No,
Because
no, I didn't get that. Say again that these
yeah,
two.
I think it's easier to I think it's easier to understand first, like in mode A dominated social worlds, it's easier to understand and locate the existence of mode C than mode B practices, because when we discuss silent trade partners, when we discuss like the coolering gift giving circuit,
Mm.
where like the gift giving service circuit is something that allows and gives space for commodity exchange between these different groups. It's easier to locate where mode C is in those social worlds. And at the same time, I think that there's a tendency to understand mode B, at least in Karatani, the presence of mode B in mode A social worlds as being against the state, those practices that mode B is there critically or negatively, as something that is to be uh, resisted. At least this is like the anti-statist position that Karatani inherits from Pierre Clastres. But I'm saying this because I think like there's this real issue, and I think like which is understanding this transition from mode A to mode A depends on us having a clear view on how mode B can present itself in mode A dominated social worlds.
Mhm.
And I was going for this point because I don't know if I understood it correctly, but we have like large scale mode A social structures. They are just very weird and very very maybe stuff that we wouldn't understand as large scale social structure. We have like confederations, which are very large. We have there are reports of semi-nomad people where they can cover great distances, especially I think they're
Mm.
like I was mentioning in the chat, Graeber and Wengro in their latest book on the origin of humanity, Sapiens for humanity students. Uh, they mention a lot some of these social worlds where they cover vast distances in Northern America, and you can always say that there is a very weird connection uh, that goes through all of America from north to south in the constructions, the mythical
Mm.
structures, which I think like Levi-Strauss tries to map. And I was thinking this because there's a part in your presentation where there's like a question mark, I don't remember which one of the slides it was, but there was like perception on one side and then symbols on the other, and then writing on the
Mhm.
symbols. And then like I was wondering about if myths, which have a paraconsistent structure in many scenes, I mean the contradictions abound. uh, they do serve in a way as a. I wonder if they have that they are that tool that is analogous, to the establishing paraconsistent distinctions.
Mhm.
Uh, I mean, these are just some thoughts because, and if we do take that seriously, there would be, I mean, scale alone might not explain. I think like it's the most difficult point. I think is explaining the transitions because it always seems that there is a point where it's not enough it's not it doesn't seem like, oh, if it grows up to a point it
Mm.
becomes the other mode. I'm it, it's like a very inviting transition, but I'm always a bit suspect about that
Mhm.
differences of degree become differences of quality.
Mhm.
It seems too philosophically, ready to be presented in a platter. And I think like when you discuss, I mean, this was quite clear when reading the essay, which I think like really condenses, I think, the main points of your presentation. I mean, there's a huge background, which would be awesome if it was in the essay, but then it would be unusable because it would be like 50 pages. But there's this discussion at the end about the not at the end, but I think like when I think Dennis even made the comment about the cooking analogy, where substitution works as a there's also a substitution in that perceptual centered form of dealing with the world. And I wonder if there is a distinction where you seem to have that in your mind. At least that was what I got the impression, which is there's a difference between an analogy, which is endlessly comparable. You go on, you add endless analogies where there are elements in, and so it's very perception based. This is an element that will link me to another element in another object, which will allow me to link to another, and you can do a series of analogies. While the state seems to have more like it seems like to be a tool that makes objects indistinct. I think there's this difference between analogy and indistinction that seems important for understanding what can and can't be done. I don't know. I'm just making
Um,
a lot of remarks. I'm sorry for the confusion. But man,
uh,
this really got me thinking a lot.
um, yeah, I also thought about narratives as a like tool for I thought about this counterexample that narratives like also can like travel quite well. Um, Probably I convinced myself too quickly that this is not like a good tool because like like narratives change and like it's like rumor like once you spread them like they like make little deviations and so on. So but I don't know if that's actually a problem for mode A. I haven't thought that out. Maybe that's a mode B problem. Um, 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 Second point was the skepticism about scale. Um, hmm. I mean, Son Rethel makes a different point actually, right? For him, it's not about scale, but it's about appropriation. Um, uh, uh, so what necessitate I would like what for Son Rethel necessitates this functional societalization, this different form of societalization uh, is appropriation. It's not scale. Logistics comes from the fact that like those two functional parts of society like get severed. Um, I don't know. Maybe um, that would be like a better solution to that. I don't know. Um, because I mean I think the main point in object or like what makes the main difference in object relations is that they are not like naturally connected anymore. They have to get connected, functions and objects. Um, it's like that's what necessitates writing and classification and bureaucracy. So theoretically, that would even like work on a very small scale. Um, yeah, I'm not sure about that.
But I think this point about the narrative that you mentioned, I think it's a very important point because I think that the fact that rumors, narratives are very easily changed, and I think the interesting thing about Lévi-Strauss is that these changes are not arbitrary, that there is a logic to them.
Hmm.
Even if it's a series of torsions, inversions, they're not like meaningless changes. I do wonder if that uh, connects to the fact that like social reproduction in these worlds is not uh, you can have like large scale communities, but the social reproduction is never centralized in them, you know,
Hmm.
because these different communities will have their hunting grounds, they will have their small farms, where they plant communally. Uh, but there is no need for since there is no need for construction of armies, since enemies wars are not
Hmm.
they're not scalable, they're not scaled, there are huge populations, there are huge like compared to like what exists today, at least after they were all decimated. But it seems like uh this process that you point out is pretty much dependent on goods needing to circulate between communities. And circulation between communities of gifts seems to be like simpler because the gifts, they don't have to be like there's no use of the gifts. I mean, they
You
are
don't
just
you don't plan with it. I mean,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And we and there's something there's a different in distinction because when you get a gift, you have to give it to someone else. So it's a different sort of reduction, you know. If it's useful, it's not something that's used as a gift, you know. I mean, actually, you can have like there are reports like, oh, I got a knife, but then a week later, someone will come to my house, ask for this knife, and I have to give them, even if it's useful for me. And at the same time, it seems that so you wouldn't need like that circuit of indistinction that the state operates, right?
But would you say there's like a societal function of myths traveling or like narratives traveling over between communities, like over, is there like a, you said like there's a certain unity, but has this unity a societal function?
Well, you know, I think this is something that's like a question that interests me. At first, I think that there is a function in this, but it's not a function that it doesn't have a global point of view. But I think myths they are also forms of they are forms of situating in the world. So like when myths travel, in a sense, you are communicating well. Yeah, I think actually that's the good question, you know.
All
I
right,
think
can
that
you repeat the question? What is the question again?
Whether I mean we compared like travel of information via writing, like or bureaucratic writing, accountants writing, and travel of information via um, speech and narratives, myths. And the question was like um, whether the travel of narratives has the same societal function, like for state societies, the bureaucracy is a necessary part for like functional societalization, for like keeping all parts of the state coordinated. And the question was whether myth or narrative have like a similar structure or like a similar purpose. Um, because
Yeah.
that would like clarify the scale question.
you know I think like at a local level, I think like Levi-Strauss' answer is like the clearest one, which is myths. They are imaginary solutions to concrete problems, which in a sense means that you will normally myths, they will be like the framework for interpreting reality, and this is a framework that has proved itself, you know, from at a local level. Now, I think the big question that you put is, okay, but what does it travel when we say that myths travel? And I wonder if, like, if we take Amerindian myths, like, there is something very strong that travels at least South America, which is what I have a better acquaintance. Myths of the differentiation between animals and humans, especially differentiating between predators and also the prey. You know, like myths that explain the difference between predators and prey. They circulate a lot. And what circulates between, and this is not a circulation that's like you have one myths at the south of Argentina that will go to the north of Venezuela. It's like there will be the transformations will always be like one point is in contact to the other, and then so well, you have a series of transformations. But like it seems that this organizing principle of helping understand like what is apparent who I wonder if it's what allows it's a technology for situating kinship structures, kinship terminology, because in Amazonia where you don't have the elementary structures of kinship because there are no descent lines that are organized. It seems that if it's terribly important all the time to be aware that you should not be confused. You should not confuse animals that act as humans with actual humans. And I think this is important. These myths arise and they exist a lot and they circulate a lot because it is like a fundamental aspect of social life, hunting and gathering and going into the woods. And this is not something that it's as if like it's the structure that highlights that it's very important not to get lost and also to understand that kinship is it's like you shouldn't also marry with just about anyone, because there are no elementary structures that define who your partner should be. But I'm just like riffing here because it's actually a thing that I'm not quite sure. I'm trying to see if I can touch upon a relevant aspect, but I would say that it has to do with the kinship structuring of societies. Because
intercommunal kinship
yeah,
structure.
because like tons of these myths, they are concerned with explaining like who you should marry, who you should not, who is an enemy, who is not. So and so I do wonder if there's that aspect, if they transmit these uh, tools for organizing the relation between kinship and nature, which is the division between nature and culture in Amerindian, the way they divide uh, nature and culture in Amerindian societies. And that has an importance when you look at how they deal with nature, which is not extraction based, but as it's a partnership. And being a partnership, it seems like the myths. There are some moments where I think that myths are the level ideology. Some moments I think they are thought as a creative thought, but now I'm trying to think like if in that framework that you developed, what would be their function? But yeah, but wouldn't have a straight up answer.
John also wrote something in the chat. I think a more clear term, I think this is about coinage. Slip uses instead of coin is token, which based on my interpretation is distinct from writing because a token is a stand-in for something else and it cannot be duplicated without losing its meaning. Coins are a type of token, but check is also an example duplicate. Yeah, bad that uh, it's not Slip's timing. Um, um, the main point here for me was that coins that coins are a social medium, and tokens would be, as I understood, slip also be a social medium. But yeah, I'm not sure about that. I tried to find some more general structure than that. Then Dennis, you also wrote something. When we perform reductions while being within the world through perception, we keep the structure of the world. Yes, exactly. When performing reductions in writing, we subtract the world, which is like turning a non-well-founded structure into a world. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's what I meant.
Yeah, I was responding to your response to me on the difference between fungi reducing the world into the dead grass and the food versus like the bureaucratic inscription of a forest. But I think that also seems to relate to Raphael's question about myth. Maybe myth, in addition to organizing like things like kingship, but it's also about preserving the non-well-founded structure,
Hmm.
right? But yeah, the question of why, what is the usefulness of a non-well-founded structure? Um, I don't know the answer,
Hmm.
but yeah, writing definitely seems to want to preserve well-foundedness because if if your laws are non-well-founded, you could it would lead to a instability in the legal system. Um, but then you have, of course, the question of like the sovereign and stuff like that, which feels like the sovereign is a way of challenging well-foundedness in the legal setting, like
Yeah.
the whole like suspension of the law in emergency situations and so on.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, this is a general thing. I mean, I was wondering whether it would be like um, a better idea to think of states not like by starting from some structure which they have, because it kind of like seems to focus on one paradigm which like oversees the variety of various or like mode B formations, and focus on this problem or like on this paradox, um, and look at the different mode B formations as different solutions to that paradox. And so one could kind of like look at how like what different strategies there have been to solve Russell's paradox or like to avoid Russell's paradox, and kind of see if there's like, which I take to be like kind of like the form of the paradox of sovereignty, whether the different forms of state or mode B formations respond are just like different strategies to respond to the same problem. I don't know. Um,
Yeah, that makes sense. Like you could have a typology of solutions
yeah.
to that problem.
So the question would be, what is gained when this problem is not even formalized, put as a problem, which is where well-foundedness wouldn't even be uh, because well-foundedness seems like the point of view of the state. So like it's only a problem. I mean, I think this is something that you said, right? Like it's only a problem from the point of view of the state.
Yeah, they
Uh,
make their own problem and then they solve the problem.
yeah,
But but you could not even you could also take the alternate approach of not even treating it as a problem, but then that implies a different a different problem, perhaps.
Yeah, I think this is the issue. Like, what makes this appear as a problem? You know? And I was actually I think this approach is interesting. I was actually remembering this is like I didn't read the book. I just saw the lecture, and it was actually a live lecture, so I can have that. But there's like the huge book by Philippe Descola, which is I think it's Beyond Nature and Culture. He writes he has a kind of a mode B, and the thing of his mode B, which is I think it's very Scott-like, uh, there is no structure of the state. I think like if we take the state to be that grid uh, disposition, it cannot have like a simple form, it cannot have a universal form because different sets of problems will demand like that it organize itself to be able to deal with this lack of well-foundedness in different manners. So states is like a very versatile structure, and I think it's a good like taking things like where you did like the classifying typology of writing. I think it's like just one thing that I would mention. I like the idea of a writing, but it doesn't appear as much in your in the essay as I think it as because it's in the title. So I wonder if like I would just change the title because writing, even if
Mhm.
it's there, you discuss a lot other stuff, and I think the accountant aspect has a lot to do with what you're talking about writing, but I don't think it's as like
Mhm.
uh
Mhm.
connected, like just
Mhm.
like for the because I think the essay itself it's very consistent, but just this aspect. But I do wonder if I think this is a better a clear problem. This is for me, because like first, like what is the use? Like what do we gain when we have well-foundedness? And but I do think at the same time, I think that this issue about the sovereign is like the appearance of a non-well-founded structure. So I think that there's
Is the what of a non-well-founded structure?
it's the appearance of a non-well-founded structure in the like supposedly well-founded structure because it's a paradoxical position, you know.
Mhm.
Uh, so I think that like it's a really important point, and I think it even helps explain. I think like when you discuss like the strategies for deciding on how you will enclose the limits of well-founding a situation, it seems that they cannot be well-founded themselves, right?
No, I'm lost.
I'm
Cognitive.
sorry. I'm sorry. I'm a master of
You can
confusion.
you can try to repeat the last question.
No, yeah, I'm like I only speak in Mode. Uh, At the end of the your talk, you discussed about the different strategies to determine vagueness.
Mhm.
Determine in the sense of specifying where the cut is. And it seems that those decisions are not explainable from within.
Yep.
So
They're
I think that's
either gappy or clutty, and both are not like the perfect solutions for the state.
yeah, because I think that's the issue, right? It's not it's only solutionable if you have an artificial plane, which writing can pretend to have, because you can put in a plan that reduces reality, but there will be some point where, like, I think I love the example of the French state, because I think like it's clearly a point where the limits of the mode B appear. right? Either in the neurosis of the Germans or the or the carelessness of the French. Uh, but I think that's a point that's pretty interesting. Like the what like deals with these remaining gaps, it cannot itself be well-founded, just like the sovereign that Dennis was commenting. I'm not sure if it was
I
a
mean,
question.
yeah, I mean the last point with vagueness was more about um paraconsistency and paracompleteness, I would say, um than about well-foundedness. Um, though these things might be somehow connected, but that's beyond my reach, my grasp. Uh,
Yeah, I'm also confused by the difference between, I mean, I understand formally what each of those things are, but how does, we never really talk about well-foundedness in STP. So I think that's an interesting connection. But I do need to go. But thanks so much, Mo, for this. It was a really good presentation, and I learned a lot, clarified a lot for me.
Thank you for discussion.
Yeah, this was great, and I put some comments on the contribution, but I think like where are you where like are there next steps in this discussion that you want to develop? Like which points do you want to, or was it like a one-off?
Oh, oof. I mean, I have this big framework that I would like to develop more, like so, um, so I mean, one thing is like working on the mode B, which is like of which I want to be part, but um, also with Slip, I'd like to kind of like get these media below the modes thing more clear and kind of like, like differentiate them against each other.
Mm-hmm.
So this would be like one puzzle stone of, you know. So next would be probably like really getting into the phenomenology part, and which was here like more like presupposed. Um and trying to find out what are the media, how do they work and stuff.
I just wanted to congratulate you on the phenomenology part because phenomenologists, they always make me feel like I'm stupid because I get lost in their maze. And it was like, and when you started doing the phenomenology bit, I was like, man, I'm going to get lost so quickly. But it was actually like really, really clear, and that was great. And have you ever read Tim Ingold, the anthropologist?
No,
Because
I don't even know him.
he's like a he's like an anthropologist that is more, I wouldn't say like he's a phenomenologist, but he's not as interested in kinship structures, for example, as he is, for example, in the structures of perception, livelihood.
Hmm.
Uh, I think he has a very phenomenology feel from what I remember of him, has a book which is like a collection of essays, which is The Perception of the Environment. Uh, it's like it's like on livelihood, dwelling, and skill. It's something that I want to get into sometime because I'm very in the mode A moments. But it really connects, I think, with the discussions because uh, he's trying to understand, I think, this connection. between living and perception and environment and social reproductive practices such as hunting. So I think like it could be a good way to, and maybe he even could provide a better point of entry than simply Levi-Straussian myths, you know.
Mhm.
But something that like uh, I'll even separate the book to get a look at, so I can have more meaningful stuff to say about this with you, because I think that it was really good, the presentation.
Thank you.
Uh,
So